Welcome to our webinar with the Virginia Commonwealth University Autism Center for Excellence. Today's topic is Drawing a Blank, Improving Comprehension for Readers on the Autism Spectrum. I'm Emily Illand, and it's my pleasure to do part 2 of this interesting webinar on improving comprehension. You may have tuned in for part 1, and if you haven't, you might go back in the archives and take a look at it. In part 1, we did a brief overview of reading, comprehension, and hyperlexia. We gained a fuller understanding of how different features of autism affect comprehension, and we identified some of the 43 skills that must be explicitly taught. Today's agenda, we're going to look at the 5 evidence-based interventions tailored to readers with autism spectrum disorders and look at some more promising strategies. The things we're going to talk about today are useful for if you're trying to assist a reader on the autism spectrum, but they can also be helpful to all kinds of readers who struggle with comprehension. A basic premise of the book, Drawing a Blank, is that the demands of the dynamic reading process present a mismatch with the cognitive skills and core deficit areas often seen in autism spectrum disorders, and therefore are at the root of the comprehension problems. So we always have to go back to the idea that these are unique readers with unique needs and a unique learning style. I wrote Drawing a Blank when I was trying to find answers to help my own son, who is now 32. He's on the autism spectrum. He's a reader with hyperlexia, a precocious self-taught reader who had a definite gap between his own ability to decode anything and his ability to understand. And his problems were masked as he was younger, but became more obvious after the age of 10, and that sent me looking for solutions. Now we're going to look at the evidence-based strategies that are available to us. When we examine the research about interventions and strategies to improve comprehension for readers on the spectrum, there are 3 general findings. First, that strategies for students on the spectrum must take into account both their general cognitive profile and their individual differences. Well, that's kind of logical. Secondly, methods helpful to students with other learning differences may be appropriate for students on the spectrum, but maybe not. And thirdly, that some methods that work for those with other learning differences will not be effective for those on the autism spectrum. So there are some methods that we might think would be helpful, yet the research shows that they backfired or weren't effective. So we're going to integrate that into the rest of our webinar today. The challenge is that we have so little to go on. In a literature review that Chang and Lin did in 2007, they did find that there were 754 articles about how to improve comprehension. But of those, only 11 had participants with autism spectrum disorder or autism. No study had anyone with the label of Asperger's. And out of the 11 studies we had, there's only 5 strategies that were identified as evidence-based. So that's why it's so important to understand the problem in general, because we're going to have to find our own solutions a lot of the time and be inventive and be selective. But the 5 that we have, it's a great starting point and something to be excited about. So what does research say yes to? The first is called primer passage, which is pre-teaching facts. The second is an informative title with a primer passage. The third is related narratives. Fourth, anaphoric cueing. And finally, idiomatic expressions. So we're going to go ahead and examine each of these 5 methods. And if you like visuals, my symbols are primer passage, linking a primer with a title, related narratives, anaphoric cueing, and idioms. So the first one is a primer passage. What is that? It's giving the student or reader the facts and cues they need to find the relevant information and make connections. So you pre-teach the concepts in the simplest form possible. And the good news is that many curricula designed for English language learners include primer passages. I like to say that students on the spectrum are like English language learners in their own language. And if you think of them that way, many methods we use for English language learners would also be very helpful to students on the spectrum. So here's an example of a primer passage, presenting just the basic facts about oceans, and I want to give you a minute to look at this. Now let's read the passage. Was it easier to read the passage and understand it because you had the primer passage? I think so. It really helps the reader identify the main ideas and reinforce those main ideas. And then if the person had to answer the comprehension questions, they have a better chance of doing so. So that's all there is to a primer passage, which is definitely doable. I think it would benefit whole classrooms of children and any kind of learner, but it would be especially helpful for readers on the spectrum who haven't really learned to identify the main ideas yet. Someone once said to me, well, isn't that like cheating? You're giving them the answers? And my response is, well, this isn't a test. We're trying to instruct someone so that they benefit more and understand more of what they're reading. And by giving them the relevant background information or facts first, they benefit more from reading, so it's more meaningful and it's more positive for them versus struggling to understand. So that was our first out of 5. Now we're on to our second strategy, which is called a primer passage with an informative title. And the first thing you do is you create a clear title for a passage that either doesn't have one or has a confusing title. Next, you prepare a primer passage with all of the main ideas of the text to be read. Thirdly, you go back and you ask the reader to notice the link between the informative title, the primer, and the actual text. So you're asking them to make those connections. And that anchors them to help them focus on the most important information. The next step is to ask the readers to go back and notice the title again, and notice the primer, and notice how all the things fit together. So you're asking them to make that link between the 3 different elements to improve their comprehension. So let's try it ourselves. Go ahead and read this and see if you know what it means. Most people are very confused by this text. Well, let me give you a primer and see if it helps. Here you go. Here's a little more priming for you. Now, what if I give you an informative title after you've been primed? Does this passage now make more sense to you? And that's the beauty of this technique. It brings it all together for the reader so that they benefit from it. Now, this is an instructional method. You're not going to do this with everything. You're going to use it as a way of teaching the reader to pay attention to these things and to begin to prime their brain to watch for those main ideas. So our third technique is called multiple thematic exposures. Now, this is a very old study from 1998, but it's pretty much all we have to go on. And adolescent students were more successful with recall and retelling when thematic stories were used as content. And thematic stories means reading more than one story on the same topic. And then when the students drew about it or wrote about it, they understood even better. And the idea here is that concepts and vocabulary learned in one story could be applied to the next and improved the comprehension of the third, and then it improved the comprehension of everything because the students were able to relate the information text to text. So for example, the three texts used in that study, you can see how old the study was: Who's in Rabbit's House, Foolish Rabbit's Big Mistake, and The Velveteen Rabbit. So thematic reading is a good idea to help somebody expand their vocabulary, concepts, and comprehension with related text. That's all there is to it. But the reason that there's benefit is because there's multiple exposure, and it also helps for some students if they actually read some of it aloud. And this is in contrast to what many readers on the spectrum do, which is rereading the same thing over and over. This is widening their horizon a bit by having related narratives. And we hope that this technique will give them greater information gain. So that's all there is to that technique, and we're on to the explicit teaching of idioms. There are two types of idioms: opaque and transparent. Opaque idioms are idioms that are not clear what they mean, like kick the bucket. What in the world would that have to do with dying? Transparent idioms are closer to the meaning, like skating on thin ice. You could understand how thin ice might be dangerous. So transparent are closer in meaning, and opaque are less clear. So a good suggestion, well, first of all, we know that we have to explicitly teach the idioms. And it's a good idea to start with idioms that are commonly used in either in literature that the person will be reading or in real life. Relevant ones to their generation and their context and their culture. And it's also a good idea to start with the transparent idioms because they're literal and concrete. So the example here is a close shave, and it gives you a picture of what it might mean if someone's picturing it literally, and then it makes that connection from what it sounds like it might mean to what it actually means. And I have looked at a lot of different books that teach idioms, and I like the ones by Marvin Turbin and Julio Maestro because they begin with that concrete literal meaning and then take the reader the next step. And here's a couple other suggestions. And a lot of people like the Amelia Bedelia series for teaching idioms because they feel that, Amelia Bedelia is always interpreting things literally, but it goes on to teach other meanings, non-literal meanings. So those might be useful. Now we're on to anaphoric cueing. I know this part of the webinar goes really fast because it's so interesting and and it's so doable. These things are so practical and doable. They don't cost anything. So that's what's exciting about these techniques. So my owl is the symbol for anaphoric cueing because we're going to teach the reader to ask who. To whom is this pronoun referring? And this technique addresses the fact that our readers have difficulty with pronouns, whether they're speaking or whether they're reading, that they don't self-monitor understanding. When they come to a pronoun, they're not asking to whom does this pronoun refer, they just keep going without clarifying that ambiguity. And that's what we want them to do. We want them to stop and ask and clarify before they continue, because the meaning will be very clouded if they don't stop to clarify. And we want the reader to begin asking questions of the text. We know many readers on the spectrum don't ask questions in real life. They don't, they don't ask a lot of who questions or why questions, unless it's in their area of interest, perhaps. But we want them to become active questioners of text as well. So to teach the skill, what you do is you start with a sentence and you highlight or underline a possessive pronoun in the sentence. And then you offer options and decide together who is referred to in each example. Now here's an example for you. Oh, after that, again, you read it together after you clarify. So here's our first example. My mother and I are baking a birthday cake. We want to surprise Grandma. Now, you would think that someone with autism could just be asked to go find to whom does the word we refer. But the researchers found that readers on the spectrum weren't able to just look for the context clues, so they needed to offer options first as part of the instructional method. Is it my mother and I? Is it Grandma and me? Is it the cake? So those are the context clues that are available. So which one is it? So you would ask the reader to go back and substitute, my mother and I want to surprise Grandma. Does that make sense? Grandma and me want to surprise Grandma. Does that make sense? The cake want to surprise Grandma. Does that make sense? So they're going to have to use a process of elimination, because they're not necessarily able to do it just by looking in context. So by process of elimination, they can find the right answer and get the concept. Stop and figure out who we is before you keep reading. And then you can move on to others and have them begin to look in the context. So for example, Geraldo and Scott have been friends a long time. They are on the same baseball team. The teacher saw that Lisa did not bring lunch and asked, do you have money to buy lunch? And help them look for those possible answers and make that connection. So the next steps will be to practice the skill while they're reading a short text and think aloud and explain how they're looking for the answer. Then you ask them to practice independently and go in, check in, and see if they're using the strategy. And finally, you would use authentic text to make sure that they're using it when they read things that they need to read, not just instructional material. So guess what? That's all 5 strategies. That's all we've got to go on based on the evidence. They're definitely useful and doable, and I think it really could make a big difference to do these things with readers. One of my favorite things about anaphoric cueing is that it teaches self-monitoring, and it might be the first time our readers realize they've got to stop and make sure they understand before they go on to the next sentence. So the research also came back with some negative findings, things to avoid that aren't a good fit. Not recommended, according to the research, are using dictionary definitions to grow vocabulary. Many people might be very relieved that the research says not to do that. And also, questions and answers was determined to be an ineffective instructional method. It's not a good way to teach someone to understand by having them read a passage and then answer questions. 2 things were found to have not improved comprehension. The first was activating prior knowledge. O'Connor and Klein said to their readers before they started, what do you know about dinosaurs? And the answer was either everything or nothing. So they found that a free-form activation of prior knowledge wasn't useful because the person either knew too much or didn't know enough. Therefore, something else like a primer passage might be a much better way, a structured way to activate prior knowledge. It has to be done, but not the typical way. They also found that a closed task does not improve reading comprehension. So for example, they gave students a sentence and they left a word blank at the end. Then they gave an option, 3 words to complete the sentence. And the students had tremendous accuracy and ability to complete the sentence. However, it did not improve their comprehension of the sentence. So they were able to successfully pick the right word without understanding what it meant. So that's a very important thing to know. You know, there are many standardized tests that use a closed task. And if you think that just by putting the right word in means that the person understands, O'Connor and Klein suggests that perhaps they don't. And certainly it didn't work as an instructional method for improving comprehension. So maybe you think 5 strategies isn't enough. I agree with you if you're right there thinking, you know, we need more ways to help these readers. So the rest of the final 2 chapters of Drawing a Blank, I went looking for other promising ideas. And what makes a practice promising? Well, when we have limited research and we have diversity of needs, it's important to capitalize on the strengths of people on the spectrum who we're trying to help. It's important to use their interests to maximize their motivation to read and gain their attention. And we want them to be able to move from their personal understanding to something more general. So that's why we would choose a promising practice, because when we don't have enough to go on from the research, we can do these other things to pick something that might be a good fit. And we can also look cautiously at other tools and decide whether it is or isn't a good fit in general for people on the spectrum or specifically for a particular reader who you're trying to help. So we'll look at a few of the options. In Drawing a Blank Chapter 5, we talk about using synonyms, using electronic dictionaries, using objects to pre-teach vocabulary, using visual dictionaries, using connotation, using word elements like suffixes, affixes, and roots, and using homographs. So these options are part of Chapter 5, and we're going to discuss a few of them right now. I want to start with the electronic dictionary. It's a wonderful, inexpensive way to instantly help a student gain access to meaning. And I didn't think of getting an electronic dictionary for my son. I wish I had thought of it so much sooner because it's a tremendous tool. And here's how it came into our awareness. So Tom was studying to be an accountant, and he was taking higher level college courses in accounting. And he came home from school one day when he was about 22, and he said, "Mom, I couldn't do one of the test questions today in accounting because I didn't know what the word conservative meant." And I said, "Well, that's definitely a problem, you know, when you can't do the math because you don't know the vocabulary." And then I thought, well, how is he going to pass the CPA exam if there's unknown vocabulary? So we went to a friend who's a psychologist who gave Tom a battery of tests that demonstrated the link between his autism and his depressed vocabulary. And then we sent the results of the test to the Board of Accountancy for the state where we live. And they wrote back and said that Tom could have an electronic dictionary for the Certified Public Accountant exam. They said they weren't trying to test his vocabulary, they were trying to test his ability to apply the principles of accounting. And Tom was able to use the electronic dictionary for all 4 sections of the test, and he probably accessed it about 28 times. If he had failed those 28 questions because of the vocabulary, he wouldn't be a CPA today. But because of the electronic dictionary, he was much more successful in his exam. And I thought, why didn't we give this to him the first day he stopped understanding? Or why didn't we give it to him in high school? Or why didn't we give it to him in college? And so that's why I want to bring this up, because I think it's such a wonderful tool to create very quick access. They're small, portable, and user-friendly. It's less disruptive. They can use it for any task, including testing, as long as it's not a vocabulary test. They can use it while listening, because sometimes there's that auditory comprehension failure and they lose the thread of meaning because they don't know what one word means in a sentence or 2 words in a sentence. And you know, there's a lot of cool versions of electronic dictionaries now. They can be an app on a smartphone. So it could look cool rather than being disruptive. And you know, I have mentioned that I think that our learners on the spectrum are like English language learners. Well, if you speak a foreign language and someone's talking to you and you don't know the meaning of one of the words, you're kind of lost and spend time trying to figure it out. And if you don't know the meaning of two of the words, you're really lost. The same is true for our readers, whether they're reading text or listening. If they don't know the meaning of one or two words, they spend a lot of mental energy trying to figure it out, whereas an electronic dictionary could resolve that pretty quickly. Another idea is to use images, and this is inspired by Albert Einstein, who said, "If I can't picture it, I can't understand it." And if we have an awareness of people on the spectrum not being able to create visual images based on the text they're reading, what if we can give them the image first? And then when they read it, they have something to refer to in their mind. And here are three examples: a pillory, a hod, and an albatross. These aren't things that you could find very commonly, but they would certainly be essential vocabulary words in a story. And so providing the pictures is a great idea. We would never want to ask our students to do a Google search for these images because sometimes bad things turn up no matter what you search for. So having a closed set of images and providing a set of images to the student would be more beneficial and safe. Another is using visuals for vocabulary support and even a riddle game. So I found images of a drawbridge, a highway bridge, and a footbridge and turned it into a riddle. I'm a bridge for people. I'm definitely not strong enough for cars. I am a footbridge. I have very modern construction and am strong enough for trucks and cars. I am a highway bridge. I'm a bridge that goes over a river. When a tall boat comes, I have to be opened. I am a drawbridge. So using similar pictures to expand on the meaning of the word bridge helps our students look at concepts, looks at adjectives, helps them compare and contrast, so they can do a lot with this. And many students on the spectrum, like all the other students you might be working with, love riddles. So this could be very useful, those visual options. The next one is roots, suffixes, and affixes. And the reason it's so helpful is because it's applying a formula to understand word meaning. And Tom said, of everything we did, this was the breakthrough strategy for him prior to the electronic dictionary. However, we didn't do this with him until he was in 12th grade. And he said, if someone had just told me that the word meanings can be combined to a bigger meaning, I could have done that a lot sooner. And so that was another regret that I have. I wish we had done it. And one really fun way to introduce this to students is to start with words that they know and love already, like from Star Wars or Harry Potter, and break down familiar words and show them how we use roots, suffixes, and affixes. And actually in drawing a blank in Appendix H, I made a list of the most popular and common of the word parts, and then put another column for the learner to put an example from their own area of interest to personalize that. So remember, we're talking about people with good memory and who are visual and concrete. So this is why this is such a promising practice. Especially for people with ability in mathematics, it kind of makes it like a mathematical formula. But the research says that learning roots, suffixes, and affixes creates access to an exponential number of vocabulary words and word meaning. So this might be something good to try with 4th graders or 5th graders, especially if you use their area of interest to get them interested in this technique. So those are some ideas for vocabulary building. Now let's talk about some visual strategies you might like to use with readers on the spectrum. Of course, like I always say, it could also help other readers. So in Chapter 6 of Drawing a Blank, we talk about closed captions, reading scripts, film to help with visualization, finding the main idea, graphic organizers, text organization cues, and highlighted text. And of these, today we're going to talk about the 3 with the check marks next to them. So the first one is closed captions, and this was something we discovered helped Tom when he was around 10. We realized that he loved watching television and movies with the captions on because it maps the speech onto print. So the words that the people were saying show below in the captions, and he made the connection between the words that he was hearing and print, and that's called mapping speech onto print. And it supports language processing, because remember, we've discussed that people with autism often have an auditory processing problem or an auditory comprehension problem. So to have both the written and spoken word together supports their processing and grows their vocabulary. You know, some people say that people with autism hear words or sentences as one long chain, like peanut butter and jelly sandwich, all one sound or a bunch of sounds, but without the breaks between the words. And so if they can hear it and then see the breaks between the words, it can help them understand better. And vocabulary is presented with the word in context. Somebody says it, it relates to something in the story or the show they're watching, and then the word appears. So it's a great way to grow vocabulary. And a nice side effect for us was Tom is a great player of the game Name That Tune, because when you put on the captions, they always put the name of the song that's playing. So that was a fun social bonus to putting on the captions, as he's great at Name That Tune. Kind of fun. Now here's another media strategy that I learned from a young man with autism who's a friend of mine. And we've all thought about showing movies before reading books because it gives the person context and visualization. But my friend Merritt said that he likes to read scripts before he reads a book, because the script tells him more than the book or the movie. It spells it out more explicitly. Now you can get all kinds of free scripts at imsdb.com and simplyscripts.com. So you might go and look there if you can find a script for some text that you'll be reading. Well, what are some of the advantages of reading scripts? Well, first of all, scripts reveal the thoughts and feelings of the characters. Even watching a movie, the person may not be able to interpret the physical cues, but in a script, it's often spelled out. Mother sounding alarmed, and then what she says next, or James looking angry. So it spells it out more. It explains how the character should react to the action. It explains different nonverbal cues and physical actions that belong to the story. The students can then act out some of the scripts to help them with their social understanding and the understanding of the story, of course, and to begin to learn to engage in dramatic play, which can be a lot of fun and even lead to benefits of joining the drama club or being involved with drama, because we know there's a lot of emerging research about the benefits of drama for many of these reasons. So to take all that and use it as a comprehension strategy, Merritt found that it worked for him, and I think it could work for a lot of people. But please don't start with Romeo and Juliet. You got to start with something a little simpler. Media, using either a movie or a play, it helps the student summarize what happened in the story, sequence, analyze. They can start to talk about the plot and the characters and the themes that they saw or read about in the plays before looking at those elements in text. And it can also help them learn to compare and contrast. How were the book and the movie the same? How were they different? How was the play different than the movie? And begin to be more critical and analytical. So the next one is another technique I also stumbled upon by luck. When Tom was doing accounting, I was doing my master's in special education and educational therapy. And we went to the bookstore together, and the book that Tom needed wasn't there. And we asked, and the young man in the bookstore said, well, we do have used books. They're over here. So we went and looked at the used books, and the first one I opened up for Tom was highlighted. by a good reader. There were all the main ideas of his text already highlighted. And I thought, well, what a great idea. We're never buying a new textbook again. We're going to be careful consumers of used textbooks. Look, we don't want somebody who highlights everything. We want to find a book that's been highlighted by someone who really has found the main idea. So that's great for college students on the spectrum. Can you imagine how helpful it is to already have the main idea identified so that you can synthesize and summarize, and you don't have to work so hard to separate relevant and irrelevant? But we could also use it for younger readers. We can highlight the textbook as an accommodation. We can use books on CD-ROMs and see if there's a highlight option there, so that we are priming them to spot those main ideas. There's also removable highlight tape that you might buy that can be put into textbooks and then removed. So in conclusion, to help our readers with hyperlexia, we have to realize that we've got to teach multiple comprehension skills. There are 43 areas of breakdown at a minimum, and we need to find efficient and strategic ways to address those gaps in skills. Normal classroom exposure is not sufficient for these students because they're sitting in the class exposed to what everyone else is exposed to, yet still have these big skill gaps. And they can severely impact the person. At first, they may mask how significant their comprehension issue is, but it can decline over time and really affect all of their learning, their attitude towards school, and their success. We want to help these people with excellent potential realize their potential and not let their comprehension issue be the thing that gets in the way. There is good research in ASD that highlights the kind of skills we need to teach, and it's important to focus on those critical prerequisite skills first, like main idea, relevant versus irrelevant, things like that, before they go on to other skills like summarization and paraphrasing. And I like to think the earlier we recognize, assess, and address this issue, the better, because then we could prevent reading comprehension failure in these students, which would be amazing. However, remember that our young readers who decode well are often off the radar for any concern about comprehension or other reading issues because their decoding looks and sounds so good. So we're not used to going deeper. Does this person with autism have a comprehension issue? We have to begin to ask that in preschool and stay with them to be sure that they're learning those skills as they go through school. But also, it's never too late to address these comprehension issues, and it could make a really significant impact on the person's quality of life. So hopefully these concepts will help you assess and intervene effectively with the person in your home or in your classroom or in your educational therapy practice, whoever it is that you're trying to assist. So the last story I have for you is one more comprehension strategy that we learned from experience. So Tom was riding the school bus coming home from school on a hot May day when the driver struck the dog of one of the children on the bus. And the dog was lying in the street bleeding and crying. And the driver turned off the bus and shut the door. And all the children were looking out the window and crying. And she said, "I'm sorry, kids, I have to wait till someone from the district comes and writes up the incident report." So for 1 hour, those kids sat on the bus in the heat with the dog out in the street crying and bleeding and everybody in the bus in total chaos. And Tom was completely shut down. He could see our house 4 doors away, but they wouldn't let him off the bus. He was in the sun, and the sun bothers him because he worries about skin cancer. And there was this chaos all around him that he didn't understand. So he came in the door after school and couldn't even speak to me. And I said, "You know what, honey, go rest. And when you feel better, come back and talk to me." So he did. About half an hour later. I said, "What happened?" He said, the bus driver hit Dustin's dog, and it was lying in the street crying and bleeding, and then it died. And I said, "Oh my gosh, how do you think Justin was feeling?" And Tom said, "Confused?" because Tom was confused by my question. I said, Tom, remember the time we went on vacation and we came home and all your fish had died and they were floating on the water? How did you feel? He said, I was really sad. I said, well, take those sad feelings and give them to Dustin because that's what he's feeling right now. And Tom said, oh, that's terrible. So the idea is that it doesn't help children with autism if we ask them to imagine what if, because they have a difficult time imagining things beyond their own experience. So instead, I asked what happened when and helped Tom relate to his own experience and feelings and then made the transfer. And that is the day that Tom learned empathy. And he has empathy now, but he is stepping himself through that process very quickly. And he learned to say, if I can't relate to something that actually happened to me, I think of the closest thing to it. So the idea is many people try to help our children by asking them to imagine, and that isn't necessarily going to work. They're going to draw a blank. So the strategy is to ask them what happened when, and use that to help them relate to a character or to help them to relate to a plot or help them to relate to literature in another way. And the idea is taking the known and relating it to the unknown. Isn't that how we all learn? So our accomplishments today in this webinar is to hopefully have put more tools in your toolbox. You've had a look at the 5 findings from research and learned those evidence-based strategies. And we've looked at some other promising techniques that may be useful to you. I hope you'll look at Drawing a Blank for fuller information. And also you may be interested in Be Safe, the movie, which is a movie that shows our young people how to interact safely with the police. And what I did is I took all the comprehension strategies that I could think of from Drawing a Blank and applied them to the concepts of safety, following instructions, and understanding what the police want you to do and how to keep yourself safe. So thank you so much for joining us for this webinar, and please come again.